Colorists spend day in and day out making detailed technical assessments of imagery. And as such, they need an environment in which they can trust their eyes to judge colours accurately and to not be fooled by simple things that can trip them up, like walls being the wrong colour or lights being the wrong colour. It's certainly true that if you are going to be delivering for theatrical, cinematic release or broadcast television, then you do need to spend a fair amount of money setting up a grading environment that meets a certain level of specification. But if you're delivering online, or if you are delivering commercial work for TV, there are still some things that you can do for not much money that will allow your grading suite to be set up in a way that you can still make those colour critical evaluations. We'll talk later about what hardware you want to have on your actual desk, what tools you want to colour grade with, monitors and control panels and things like that. But right now I want to concentrate on the actual environment that you're sat in, that you're working in, and simple tips that you can use to create an environment in which your eyes can be trusted and that you can make critical evaluation of the images in front of you. Number one on my list of tips is to make sure that you black out all daylight. Daylight's kind of your enemy when it comes to colour grading because, as you know, if you've ever filmed in natural light, the temperature of daylight varies quite a bit. It can be 6,400, which is what we've just measured the white balance here because it's a little bit overcast right now. But then when the sun comes out, that can go 5.5, 5.4. You have quite a big variation of colour temperature with daylight. And the last thing you want when you're judging colours on a screen in a colour grading environment ambient colour temperature varying, because your eyes will be adjusting to that, and therefore the colours on your reference monitor will appear to be shifting constantly. So by cutting out all natural light, we remove that variation, and the quickest and easiest way to cut out daylight is with blackout blinds. It could be cheap little pop-up ones, the type of thing you might buy for a child's bedroom, or it could be, if you're in a professional grading suite, that you're putting in proper blackout electric blinds that kind of raise and lower and have them on a nice cool little remote control, impress your clients. However you choose to cut out the natural light, the important thing is that you do cut that natural light out and avoid that variation of colour temperature shifting your natural white balance of your eyes. If you are colour grading for theatrical release, if your stuff is going to be seen in a cinema, you can black out your colour grading suite and that's it, because you want to actually grade in the same ambient illumination as where your viewers are going to be viewing your stuff. So if they're viewing your stuff in a cinema, they'll be viewing it in blacked out conditions, and so you should be grading it in blacked out conditions. You should also be using a projector as your reference because, again, that's how your viewer is going to be seeing it, through a projected image. But if you're grading for TV or you're grading for online delivery, then you are going to want some ambient light in your colour grading suite. So we've cut out the natural light, but now we need to bring in our own ambient light. The crucial thing here is, of course, the ambient light we bring in, we can control the colour temperature of it. And the colour temperature that we're looking for here with our artificial lights that we bring into our suite is 6,500 Kelvin. That's a really important number because that is the white point of your reference monitor and your TV and every device that you've ever watched content on. Our lights that we bring into our grading suite must match that colour temperature, and they need to match it in a pretty accurate way. And in fact, there is a scale that will tell you how accurately a light reproduces a certain colour temperature and holds that colour temperature. There's CRI, the Colour Rendering Index, which has been around since the 1960s, which is very good for measuring the consistency of tungsten light fixtures. But there is a more modern way of measuring, the TLCI, the Television Lighting Consistency Index, which tells us how good more modern lights, particularly LED lights, are at producing a colour temperature and maintaining it. Actually, both of them use exactly the same scale. They both top out at 100. And so in either case, you're looking for a light fixture that is in the sort of high 90s if possible. And that will mean you have a very good level of consistency and rendering of that colour temperature. Depending on where your stuff is destined, it might be that you can cut corners here. For example, I know it's much easier to find lower CRI, sort of 80, 85 LEDs that are 6,500 Kelvin on Amazon. They can be only a couple of pounds. So you might choose to compromise in order to keep those costs down. Whatever quality of 6,500 Kelvin bulbs you get, it's a good idea to get dimmable ones because then you can adjust it up or down depending on where you're delivering to. As for the level of illumination in the room, what you're looking to create is a ambient lighting level that matches the environment where your viewer is going to be watching your content, or as best as you can manage anyway. So if you're delivering graded content for broadcast, you would try and recreate a situation like a living room in an evening kind of situation, and you'd be looking for a level of illumination that's about 10% of the brightness of the screen, your reference monitor. Well, your reference monitor would be about 100 candela per square meter, or 100 nits if you're delivering for broadcast. That's what's specified in Rec 709. And so your ambient level would be 10% of that, 10 nits or 10 candela per square meter. If your graded content's going out online, your reference monitor would be actually brighter, so it would be about 120 nits. And so your ambient level should be about 12 nits. In either case, you can measure that with a light meter, or you can use a waveform monitor on a camera, or you could just eyeball it. You want to get it roughly 10% of the brightness of your screen. So if you set the ambient illumination in your grading suite to 10% of your monitor, then you'll create the right levels of light. But there's one crucial last piece of the puzzle here. You need to be careful that you're not casting shadows behind your reference monitor. If there are shadows around and behind your reference monitor, then that darkness against the surround of your reference monitor will trick your eyes into thinking that the content that you're grading is lighter than it actually is. When people then watch that back in a lighter environment where the area surrounding their monitoring device, their phone or their TV, is brighter, then your stuff is darker than you imagined it would be when you were grading it. So it's really important that those levels of illumination are maintained throughout the grading environment, but in particular behind the reference monitor. So you want a diffuse 6500 Kelvin light source behind your screen. Now there's no better way of doing that than using Bias Lighting's Media Light Eclipse. This is a really small, simple strip LED that actually sticks to the back of your reference monitor, and it's powered via USB. You just plug it into the USB socket, and that gives you the power you need to cast this nice diffuse 6500 Kelvin light. They're high CRI or high TLCI, and they can just be stuck around the surround of your monitor. You can get them in different lengths depending on the size of your reference monitor, and they even have a nice little inline dimmer, so you can adjust the level of illumination to match the ambient level based on where you're delivering your content to. So by the time you've cut out all daylight and brought in some ambient lights at 6500 Kelvin, and then thought about how you can create that diffuse light behind and around your reference monitor, lighting wise you're pretty well set, and hopefully you can see that it's not too complicated or even too costly to get to that stage. The next thing to do though is potentially a bit troublesome and certainly more expensive, and that is to think about your walls. The walls in your colour grading environment must be pigment free. They must be spectrally flat, and ideally a 50% reflectance or 18% grey. Now you might think I'll just nip down the hardware store and buy some grey paint. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to actually create paint that's completely pigment free, and there's only really one company that are known for creating this, and they're a company called GTI. So GTI make a pigment-free paint called N5. N5 is how bright it is, which is more or less 50% reflectance. You can also buy N7, I think they do an N8 as well, but N5 is perfect for colour grading environments. It gives you a roughly 50-60% reflectance value, but the key thing is it's pigment-free, and you must have that on the wall that surrounds your reference monitors. All of your peripheral vision, so whatever wall is directly in front of you and behind your reference monitor, that has to have that pigment-free paint on there. Otherwise, the 6500 Kelvin lights that you've illuminated your space with will bounce off that wall, and if it's not pigment-free, that 6500 Kelvin, when it bounces back into your eyes, is now a different colour, and your eyes will adjust for that, and every colour you look at on your screen, on your reference monitor, will be tinted and wrong. So you can see it's really important that you get that step right. But what if you can't paint your walls? What if you're leasing a studio space, or you're trying to set up a home studio and your partner won't let you paint the walls? Well, a good tip I would recommend is getting hold of 8x4 foot polyboards. You can buy these for £10–20 from rental houses. In fact, I got one really cheap that had been previously used, had a few scuffs on it. If you grab one of those polyboards, you can paint it with a simple roller, paint the polyboard on one side, and then you can just slip that behind your reference monitor, and if you're about 1 or 2 meters away from your reference monitor, an 8 by 4 foot polyboard will actually film most of your peripheral vision, and it will sit directly behind your reference monitor exactly where you want it to be. If you happen to also shoot, then it's quite a double win because you've got a multiple use out of it. You can take that polyboard away with you and use it for bounce. You can keep the other side as white, or you can paint it black and use it for negative fill, and you've got dual use out of that polyboard. But it could be a cheap and easy way for you to get that pigment-free paint in behind your reference monitor, allowing your eyes to be working at their best whilst you're colour grading. So those are my tips for how you might approach setting up a colour reference environment. But now let's go back and look at the types of tools and monitors that you might choose to use and place on your desk whilst you're colour grading your material. I've got a Blackmagic Design mini control surface, which works specifically with Blackmagic's DaVinci Resolve software. It gives me a whole range of quick buttons and dials for working with primary corrections, secondary corrections, and there's an additional panel at the top where I can do things like set power windows, I can make qualifications from there, I can create new nodes, I can take stills and play them back. There's tons of stuff that I can do from this, and although it's overwhelming when you first start using these control surfaces, once you build up your muscle memory and you kind of get used to using it, the big thing about them is not only can you do multiple changes very quickly, it frees your eyes up, and that is the biggest goal of this, is it frees you up to actually look at your finished image and make changes at the same time, which is brilliant. If you're down on a keyboard and on a mouse and you're looking up and up, and you lose that connection with your material. And if you can keep your eyes on the prize, as I say, then you're going to get better results and you're going to be able to work quicker. So the control surface is step one here. My main computer that's driving this, it doesn't matter what computer you use. I happen to have an iMac Pro here. I've always used Macs. This is is the fastest desktop that they currently offer. I do a lot of HDR, a lot of 4K, I work with 8K, so I need something very, very quick, and this does that for me. It's got a very quick graphics card in it as well, and that's the big thing. It doesn't really matter too much about other things, but if you can just get hold of the beefiest and highest caliber graphics card that you can for your system, that's the thing that's going to make a big difference when it comes to color grading, particularly in DaVinci Resolve, but any software you choose to use. So there's my computer, and that's running my GUI, my GUI, my graphical user interface, which means all my software tools and the program I'm running is viewable to me, and I'm controlling it through either the Surface or the mouse or the keyboard in that fashion. This in turn is sending out a video signal to a box made by Blackmagic Design, which is called an Ultra Studio, and that Ultra Studio is the Extreme 3 that we're using. It's taking a Thunderbolt 3 connection out the back of my iMac into it, and then it's then taking that video signal and sending it out over quad SDI, so that's 4 SDI cables. SDI cable A is sending out the top quarter, and then you've got SDI cable B taking up the top right quarter, and so on and so forth. And so if one of them's missing, you have this strange thing where part of your image is disappearing, and if you plug them in the wrong order, then you have your image in the wrong order on your display. So make sure that A goes to A and B goes to B and such like. The Ultra Studio is sending out to my reference panel, and I've also just got a straightforward HDMI cable running into my other monitor here. And the idea is here that I can look at my interface and work with that when I'm controlling the software. I'm looking here when I want to get a visual check that my final image is looking good. And because this is calibrated and I can trust it, this is my gut instinct monitor. This is the one that, you know, it's essentially the master. If it doesn't look good on that, then I go back to square one. If it's, you know, if there are problems elsewhere, then it's time to kind of investigate. But this one, as long as it's calibrated, I should be able to trust it 100%. So this is the most important one for viewing. This is the most important one for controlling. And this one I use for my scopes. I find it incredibly useful to have a separate monitor just for your scopes, because your scopes are so important whilst you're working. So my eyes hopefully are able to trust this, and my brain is able to trust the scopes, and all of that coming together works really nicely. I also just think a 3-screen setup just works nice in terms of symmetry, which sounds like it's, you know, a facile thing to mention, but actually in terms of my body movements, I'm essentially always orientated forwards, and I'm moving back, so it means that my back's actually not permanently fused like this. I see people with 2 monitor setups where they're in front of them and to the side, and they tend to sit at the side like that, and it puts really strong pressure on the base of your spine. So either work with one directly in front of you and then one up above it, so on a far wall maybe, so you could have a big monitor that's sort of further away and up on a wall so you can glance up. That's great for your posture and your back. or have a triptych like this where we can just move back and forth to our scopes, to our UI, to our finished monitor. It's the sort of best option really for your back. In terms of a mouse, I think it's good to have a multi-button mouse. I haven't got one here because we're just using the standard mouse that comes with the iMac Pro for today, but normally I would have a multi-function mouse that allows me to do a couple of extra quick things and shortcuts like copying and pasting grades and stuff like that just on a single middle click. What goes on the desk is very personal, I find. This is kind of your personal stamp and your own personal setup, but what's going on with your monitors I think should be consistent, and you should look at what other professionals are doing or what I advise you to do and try and replicate that as closely as you can. Once you've got your grading suite set up, one of the first and most important jobs that you should do is calibrate all of your monitors, anything that you're going to be looking at. Obviously your reference monitor is of the utmost importance that is calibrated, but it's also a really good idea to calibrate any other monitors as well, and that includes your computer monitor. The last thing you want is a client, particularly if they're sat next to you, questioning why does that look different from that. And with a reference monitor you won't have to calibrate hugely often. I mean, you might have to do it every month or two. With the really expensive ones you can do them a longer time between calibrations. But with a cheaper monitor, a computer monitor is, even on an expensive computer like this iMac Pro, you are still nowhere near the levels of tolerances that a reference monitor would have. You would almost certainly need to calibrate that before every single session. So however often that happens, if I'm doing 2 sessions in a week, then I'm going to do it twice in that week. If I'm only doing one session 1 month and another session the following month, then I would do it just before the session. Every couple of weeks, if you want to just do it on a schedule, it's much more frequent than you would have to do a proper reference quality broadcast monitor. But it's worth doing because, as I say, you don't want, even from your own point of view, let alone the clients, you don't want to be questioning what's going on, or at the very least just distracted by the shifts in colour, because your eyes will get used to looking at it wrong potentially on one, and then every time you look there's a moment where your eyes would then be adjusting to the correct image, and it might just be long enough for you to question something and make a wrong decision. So it's really worth doing it, and you don't have to spend a huge amount of money on this as well. I use the X-Rite i1 Display Pro. I'm going to use it first of all to get my display on my iMac Pro calibrated using the software that comes with that Pro, and then what I'll do is I'll show you how I would then calibrate my reference monitor to make sure that they match. The first thing I'm going to do is use the i1 Profiler software that comes with the X-Rite i1 Display Pro. So it's automatically picked up my iMac's built-in display. You can choose what type of display technology, which is mainly about the backlight that it's using. So this is using a white LED, which is an LED backlight, which is common on, particularly modern Apple computers, but a lot of modern computer displays use these thin, pure white LED backlights. The white point that we want to choose, there's a number of choices here. I'm choosing D65 because that's the standard white reference point. D65 is a label. It actually specifically means 6,504 Kelvin. The luminance, now that's a really important point. The luminance, as in the brightness of your display and what you're trying to calibrate to, needs to be decided upon. And 120 candelas per square meter, which is also known as 120 nits. So the term nits and candelas per square meter, or CD/M squared, that's actually the same thing. They're two different units of measurements. Nits is like a colloquialism. It's not a scientific measurement, but it's used as a much simpler way of saying candelas per square meter, which is good. So 120 nits would be what you were after if you were delivering online. 100 nits would be perfect if you were delivering for broadcast. 80 nits there would be something that you would choose if you were delivering, say, a DCP, which is a package for cinema delivery if you're going to a festival, and you would want to be grading in an almost blacked out environment for that. So in this case, I'm going to choose 120 nits because, as I said, most of my stuff is going out online, and also, as you can probably tell, we're not in a proper color grading suite, so it would be very dark if I did it any darker than that. So luminance is the overall brightness of your actual screen, but beneath that we have our gamma choice. A camera will shoot with an applied gamma, and then a screen will invert that gamma when it's displayed back to you to basically correct that back to a linear, but you've got the advantages of shooting things and recording and displaying things in a way that more closely matches the way that our eyes work, which are non-linear. So how much you pull that gamma across determines on how bright the screen ends up being and how much it's correcting for that. So a gamma of 2.2 would be really useful for if you're grading in a brighter environment and you're going out to internet delivery. A gamma of 2.4 would be useful if you were grading for broadcast and you were in a broadcast spec dimly lit grading suite, which we'll talk about the values for that in a minute. And a gamma of 2.6 would be used if you were color grading for delivery to a cinema where you'd be watching it in blacked out conditions, and so therefore you'd be color grading it in blacked out conditions. Our brains make brightness assumptions comparatively, not absolutely. We don't have a built-in RGB checker, so everything we look at, we get a spot measurement of its brightness. Everything that we see is based on what surrounds it. That's what we're trying to deal with here by setting the display gamma of what we're looking at, the object, and balancing that with the ambient light level in the room that we're in, the grading suite, and taking into account where we're going to be delivering to as best we can. I have a little example here. It's very difficult once this is compressed and in a video and on a website. It might not have quite the same effect as it does in person, but you should perceive that the right-hand box is a darker grey than the grey box on the left-hand side. And as that dark area that surrounds it on the left gets darker, so the box inside will appear lighter, and as the lighter area on the right gets lighter, the box inside would appear darker, though they would never be changing, and in fact they are exactly the same shade of grey right now, but when you look at them, you see them as lighter than one or darker than the other. And literally that box in the middle is your computer screen, and what's surrounding it is your grading suite. So if I brightened this grey box on the right-hand side, it would counteract the effect to make it perceptually the same as the one on the left, or vice versa. And that's exactly what display gamma is doing. It's allowing us to counteract that function of vision, and we can make more accurate decisions without kind of basically grading everything and then delivering it and thinking the whole thing looks darker or lighter than it originally was meant to be. So essentially what we've done now is we've chosen the white point, 6,504 Kelvin, how bright our screen is, and the display gamma that we're choosing based on our delivery and the grading suite environment that we're in. You obviously can't predict where every single person is going to consume your content once it's left your color grading suite, but we can make best guesses and we can make sure that we're at least thinking about it so that we've done our job once it's left our suite.